I'm not. The discussion about Ireland is certainly in the British media has been so relentlessly focused on the question of the Irish backstop, the question of the Northern Irish border, and what is going to happen in Northern Ireland. All important questions, but actually Brexit, as the Irish government keeps saying, is a massively impactful thing for Ireland. So this panel is going to look at what life for Ireland after Brexit, good and bad, challenges and opportunities. And I'm pleased to say we've got a really diverse and interesting panel to do that, to talk about both the politics and the economics of Brexit for Ireland. On my far left here, Federico Fabbrini, who's a European law professor at Dublin City University and the founder of their Brexit Institute. Next to him, Brigid Laffan, who is the head of the Robert Schuman Centre at the European University Institute in Florence and the holder of a host of awards, including the Order of Merit, which he was given by the President of France in 2010. Katherine Maroney is the head of business banking at Allied Irish Bank, which is the biggest bank in Ireland, commercial and retail, 10,000 employees, 200 branches, and she's going to talk about the impacts of Brexit on different sectors of the economy. Gerald Angley is counsellor at the Irish Embassy. We'll talk about Anglo-Irish relations, which he used to head back up in Dublin, formerly posted to Paris. Experienced Irish diplomat, and on my far right, Alan Houmann, who's the head of public affairs at CitiBank, had a host of policy positions advising the European Commission, HM Treasury, and runs CitiBank's relations with government and with the European institutions. Brigid is going to start, and so you can all see, because apparently nobody can see, she's going to take the podium.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The Irish President described Brexit last week in Florence as a special delivery, one that we did not want. And I suspect if we had the opportunity, we would say return to sender, address unknown. But of course, there is no return to sender for Brexit. It is going to happen. But it's also very worrying that we can have here this morning a member of the House of Commons for whom the lack of understanding of the deep and dangerous consequences potentially for the island of Ireland in Brexit. It is that lack of recognition of the right of the Irish state and its political system to take care of its own interests in this turbulent world that worries us and, in a way, at times enrages us. There is real and deep irritation when it is identified as the problem of an Irish Taoiseach or an Irish Taoiseach. So what are the objectives of the Irish state and government when they look at this? Firstly, damage limitation. Brexit-proof the border and the Irish economy to the extent possible. Secondly, have a conversation at domestic level about where Ireland is going. Thirdly, position Ireland in the emerging EU. And finally, and this is really important, for Ireland, it wants an EU that works. It doesn't want a disintegrating EU, it wants an EU that works. Ireland is a small state, and one of the great advantages of being a small state is you know you're small. You know you have limited political and diplomatic capital, and you know you must use it carefully. So what is the EU for Ireland? It is its geopolitical, geo-economic anchor and shelter. And that's not going to change, despite the fact that elements of that anchor are being taken up. EU membership is the settled will of the people, and we hear a lot about the will of the people here. 92% of the Irish want to remain in the EU, and in the age group 15 to 24, it's 97%. I don't think you can have a consensus like that in a democracy very easily. So Ireland's future is not in the Anglosphere. Ireland's future is in the EU and the wider world. What are the advantages of the Irish state in tackling this? It has an extremely cohesive diplomatic and political system. There are very close relations across the upper echelons of the Irish state elite. They know each other, they trust each other, and they talk to each other. It's also a country that has engaged significantly in deliberative democracy. And the level of public discourse around Brexit is unprecedented in my experience. Firstly, there's a Brexit Stakeholder Forum bringing together everyone who has an interest in what is happening. They get voice, they get information, they get access. Secondly, there's an all-island civic dialogue on what the options are for all of Ireland, and as we heard, we need to think about all Ireland and its people. And finally, there's been a very active engagement on the future of the EU over the last 6 months. So there's very active engagement with the body politic on where this country is going. And precisely because of the dangers of Brexit and the turbulence involved in Brexit, the government also has published plans for Ireland 2040. In other words, the project for the future way beyond what we're experiencing now. So how does Ireland position itself in this new EU? The EU 27 is already a reality, long before Brexit formally happens. All of the member states of the EU are repositioning themselves, they're reassessing, and they're looking at where they are in the emerging system. And Ireland has clearly identified the kind of state it will be in the EU to the future, and that is it will be part of the Hansa League, it will be part of the small state group of northern states with Ireland in the west to Finland in the north, led by the Netherlands. It's already moved on, they're meeting bilaterally, they're meeting trilaterally, the bilateral relations are greatly strengthened. So the Hansa League is already post-Brexit. And in my view, that's how Ireland, it will be a net contributor to the EU budget, as it should be, given its level of economic development. So the Hansa League is the kind of state Ireland will be. It will want, therefore, to maintain the EU as liberal a project in trade terms as possible, to watch the level of regulation. The Irish are not instinctively Euro-federalists. The Irish are extremely pragmatic about the kind of political order they want to see. But they have no doubt that a strong EU is in the interests of the Irish state and its people. So what are the icebergs? What are those policy areas where there is potential difficulty? I would say defence and security. Ireland is non-member of NATO. And Ireland's neutrality has always been more about Irish identity than it has been about defence, because in the 20th century, at least in the latter half, we found ourselves in a very safe part of the world. Ireland has joined PESCO and, in my view, will continue to be parts of coalitions of the willing involved in peacekeeping, etc., etc. But there is a cohort of the Irish electorate, I would say it's about 30%, that are always worried about the famous European army. I think we wait quite a while for that army. But that's a neuralgic point and something that the society has to discuss. The other is Ireland's growth model. We heard this morning about corporate tax, 12.5%. That's not, in my view, a problem because it requires unanimity to change the basic tax rates in Europe. What is really dangerous for Ireland is if and when it allows large multinational companies pay little or no tax at all. And it was, as you know, the Apple case in August 2016, where it was very clear that Apple had not paid anything like the tax that a multinational should have paid, and there was under competition law, the Commission judged against it. And I think Ireland has to stop this. It has got to face up to the downside of, and that's not, I'm not arguing that it should give up its corporate tax rate, simply that it's got to police how that tax rate is used. And what it has to be extremely careful of is anything that can be construed as or is tax evasion by large multinational companies. The other area is regulation. As we know, Dublin has, or Ireland has, a lot of these social media companies, their European headquarters are in Dublin. It's got to ensure that these are properly regulated. We have all got to be extremely concerned about the role of social media in our democratic processes, and Ireland cannot and should not be the state that allows any of this to happen. And then there's potentially for Ireland the long-term transformative effect of what happens on the island of Ireland post-Brexit over the next 20 years. And that is an unknown. I'll just finish by where I think Brexit is at the moment, because in order for Ireland to have a post-Brexit future, Brexit has to come to some sort of conclusion at some stage over the next number of years. I think there is little evidence so far that the United Kingdom government has put on the table anything like a detailed enough specification of what it thinks solves the Irish border. There is effectively nothing on paper. And there's a June European Council coming. There will, in my view, be a crisis on Brexit at some stage, whether it's in June or October. My view is better June, because October is much too late. But whenever I come to the UK now, I sometimes feel I'm on another planet. That there genuinely is not an understanding of how big the gap is. And there's a read over to Brussels that, oh, the Commission will agree this and the Commission. You never know how the EU responds until you put paper on the table. And this government has not put, given the nature of the Brexit negotiations, this lack of state capacity to put decent documents on the table in order to, so that they at least can be prosecuted through a negotiation system. So unless something dramatic happens in the next month, I think June is going to be a date with destiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brigid. Trenchant as ever. Ireland's future is not in the Anglosphere. You heard it there first. We'll do some business now. Back to brass tacks. Katherine Maroney. Sorry. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Almost afternoon. I am going to talk about business. In addition to my role as Head of Business Banking for AIB, I also chair our corporate finance business, which takes me into the UK market. It's Irish and UK. And I'm the incoming president for Dublin Chamber in 2020. So I say that to you because even though I'm going to speak entirely about business sentiment, and the implications of Brexit, I do want to say, particularly today on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement as it's called, that as a business person, nothing matters more than the 20 years of peace. So the reason I say that to you is because whether you're a business person or a politician or you're in education, whatever aspect of Brexit you look at, and people ask me all the time about the upsides and the downsides, and from an Irish perspective, and indeed from a Northern Irish perspective, the opportunities are relative, because overall, when you look at the business perspectives, and even if you look at what it's done to the currency here, they're pretty challenging. I'll speak briefly to the UK. I'm happy to do that. But that is the overarching, and I think when we speak about borders and tariffs and trade, the language that we use has to be very mindful of the fact that business only thrives in a secure and peaceful environment. That's really critical. So just want to say that to start. We do a sentiment survey. We do it on Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, an All-Ireland survey. And we do a composite sentiment. We've been doing it now since the Brexit decision was made, so we've 3/4 of a trend line. And just to give you a feel for that, it measures 4 things, and it's across all of the sectors. So there's a sectoral perspective within it, and across all regions. And it measures the impact from a business perspective of how they perceive the impact on business now, how they perceive the impact on business in the future. And by future, it specifies the next 5 years to them in the survey. The level of visibility companies have when making key decisions in this environment. And finally, it measures what they believe the wider economic impact of Brexit will be. And it's interesting because they started off fairly well aligned and very negative. The spectrum goes from minus 100 to plus 100. And both started at a minus 41. I promise not to bamboozle you with the figures, but they do help in terms of where the sentiment has gone. Interestingly, the Northern Ireland piece, when you pull that out, has gone more positive. It's trended back towards a minus 31, if you can call that positive. That's what I mean by relative. And the Northern Ireland key concern out of those four, very similar to the UK really, is that lack of visibility. It's very difficult to plan when you don't know what you're planning for. Of course, you can have contingency plans around supply chains, but when you don't know whether you're going to be dealing with tariffs and border delays and what they can do with acceptable timelines for shelf life on products, and particularly in two, if I can say three economies where agriculture, food and beverage are really important. So for the North, that lack of visibility is really key. And the key sectors within all of the sectors that we look at, fair to say they're all negative again, but the most negative are retail. They're very concerned about higher import prices. Tourism, for obvious reasons, particularly around the border, and manufacturing. They're their three concerns. When you move to the south of the Republic of Ireland, it started at that high negative, moved back, both of them converged in the second survey to minus 36, and the Republic of Ireland, or the south, because it's shorter to say, has moved back to a negative minus 41 in this latest quarter. That latest quarter was taken just before the March transition agreement. Interestingly, in the Republic, the concern is more about the future impact. Their concern there is what will happen in the various subsectors. And when you look into the various different subsectors, there are different concerns there. They're very negative, food and drink being the most negative, concerned about tariffs, border delays, manufacturing, particularly pharma, just given how it's internationally traded, and then obviously retail, particularly concerned about inflating import prices, and we're so reliant on the UK as our partner. What I will say to you as a takeout is, what concerns us is there's very little planning going on for Brexit at the moment. Less than 4% of companies have a formal plan in the south, and in the north less than 2%. Now, nearly half of them are planning to have a plan, but there's very little contingency planning actually done. So I think I've coined a new phrase there. So I think a concern for both of us, to briefly touch on the UK, I think I'm okay for time, is that it is impacting investment. And it's impacting it here, and it's impacting it across south and north of Ireland. Investment is low pending clarity. Service providers are looking abroad to hedge their businesses. The weak pound here is causing inflation for you, and there's a serious issue around staffing. The whole issue of people being afraid to come to the UK now, particularly in the healthcare and hospitality sectors, you're seeing severe shortages. So any upsides are relative, I think. Now, that is not to say, I'm not a politician, but critical, coming back to my first time, we must respect the vote of the people who have voted. And our job as leaders of business, industry, politics, is to find a way. It took us years to negotiate the peace process. It has stood us well in the last 20 years. And the really, really critical thing for us is to keep talking. I am absolutely ambivalent to whether it's June or October. The most critical thing is that we get to a point where it's pro-citizens first, all citizens, and secondly, trade will thrive in that environment, if I may say that. I have lots I could say to you, but I'm very conscious I'm up against the clock. Very happy to take questions on the various sectors, if you wish, when it comes to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Plans about plans where there's nothing to plan for. I'm going to go back to politics now. Brigid outlined how perhaps Ireland might see itself in its role in the European Union. Federico is going to talk maybe a little bit about how the European Union might receive Ireland.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your introduction. Of course, thanks a lot to the UK in a Changing Europe project, to Houmann and his team for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be in London and discuss about Ireland. As Peter said, indeed, I will be taking mostly a European perspective on the topic of our panel this morning. It is true I am the director of the Brexit Institute at DCU, which is Ireland-only center specifically focused on Brexit, but I also figured I'm actually the only one who's not neither Irish nor British on this panel. So I'll take a European perspective on the topic that we are discussing today, and I will mostly base my remarks on this report entitled "The Institutional Consequences of a Hard Brexit" that I was asked to write by the European Parliament Constitutional Affairs Committee. The report was published Wednesday last week, and I will present it in Brussels on Thursday this week. It's freely available online, so I would commend it to you if you are interested on this. So the first point I should probably mention is that I think it is noteworthy that in May 2018, the European Parliament is commissioning a report on a hard Brexit. And I think this is telling of the concern that in the European capital there is today about the possibility that the whole negotiation process might collapse. And the reason is, of course, Northern Ireland. If there is something that might blow up the entire negotiation process, the withdrawal agreement transition and the framework for future relation, is precisely the lack of agreement between the two negotiating parties on how to deal with the Northern Irish issue. So I think from a European perspective, it is certainly important to emphasize how much worry there is for this issue. And of course, from an Irish perspective, a hard Brexit scenario would be extremely challenging. It would raise tremendous problem in terms of trade, cooperation in the field of security and justice, and so on. So the second point I want to make is that I think as the clock is indeed ticking, we need to start planning contingency measures. And that applies to business, but applies, of course, also to institutions and government alike. And part of what I've been trying to do in this report I was asked to write is to think critically of what might be some options on the table. Now, let me be very clear from the start. I don't think we really have any sort of silver bullet that might solve the problem. The best way to deal with the problem is to maintain Britain in the custom union and the internal market. And by the way, we can come back to this later on in the discussion. There is a heck of a difference between the EEA and the EU. Those who tell you it's the same, they have no clue what they're talking about. It's two different regimes, two entirely different scenarios of integration. So I think that option ought to be on the table. But if we end up with no deal, what can be done from the European side? Well, there is an interesting provision in the GATT agreement, which I want to bring to your attention. It's a never-used clause of Article 24.3 of the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which introduces the so-called frontier traffic exception. This is, ironically, it's a clause that was initially conceived for my home state, Italy. After World War II, an Italian city called Trieste was contested between Italy and Yugoslavia, and the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariff introduced a little clause that said, well, regardless of where the city will end up being, you can avoid having a custom border between that city and the other jurisdiction. Now, if that clause is pushed to its limit, what the European Union could do in order to avoid a custom border is to declare the territory of Northern Ireland as a frontier zone to the EU custom union, so avoiding the need for introducing custom control. Now, a couple of important caveats that are worth mentioning here. We are talking here about customs control. So the frontier traffic exception under GATT would allow the EU to waive custom controls, but it wouldn't allow the EU to waive regulatory phytosanitary controls measures. Those would still have to be in place. And of course, the second caveat is that this applies from the EU vis-à-vis the UK, but it wouldn't prevent, it wouldn't apply the other way, meaning the UK would still probably need to put up a custom border. So we are clearly facing here a suboptimal choice, but I think it's important to put that on the table just to think creatively in case we are heading towards a cliff edge. And a very final point before I wrap up. It's obvious that applying the GATT agreement and the frontier traffic exception in the context of Northern Ireland is, as I said, a suboptimal solution. The problem being mostly that it opens up a huge loophole for criminal activities. So I think that would require a lot of goodwill also from the EU side vis-à-vis Ireland. And I think that touches upon a point that Brigid was making before, that as we move forward, I think the Irish government has been extremely clever and loyal towards the European Union. It has stuck to the EU position, never being bought out by the UK in a one-to-one negotiation. And I think Europe has been very loyal and supportive of the Irish position. But in the long term, that might require some trade-off on issues like security or taxation. So I think from an Irish perspective, in the long-term future, there will have to be reconsideration of some policy priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Fascinating, the frontier traffic exception. I suspect that Jacob Rees-Mogg ought not to be told about that. We're going to go now to banking, capital markets, what happens when we leave Europe, what happens with the city, how is Europe going to adjust, and what does that mean for Ireland? Alan.
Thank you very much. So I represent CitiBank. We're a very large American bank, and our interest in this is that we have thousands of people in Belfast and thousands of people in Dublin. So we're very focused on a good resolution of this question. And as we always say to the politicians, stability, predictability, a nice working environment is exactly what international firms need. And all of those, none of those things appear to be on the table at the moment. So it makes myself and my bosses in New York a little bit nervous when the future is very cloudy indeed. And I guess the biggest uncertainties are in this Brexit process. The exit treaty is not yet clear. The largest single bit of it is the Irish border question, but embedded in that is also the transition. And the transition, as Barnier says, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. So while political masters tell us that they have a political agreement on transition, I'm afraid our regulators are telling us the opposite. It's not legally settled yet. Therefore, our regulators tell us that we are not to slow down, we are to speed up our plans, whatever those plans might be. And if the ECB put it on its website the day the political agreement on transition was announced, saying this does not matter. Until this is signed and ratified as a treaty, continue what you're doing. And then on the future relationship, nothing, we gather the negotiations haven't even started. And so what sort of deal is the UK looking for the future? Not in the next 2 years, but in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And the focus makes us nervous if it's all about free trade agreements on goods when 85% plus of the UK economy is in services. So we have to think, and financial services. And so we have to think, what is the future relationship in services? And I raise this because Ireland, along with Germany, frankly, is pitching to be a financial services centre. Most of the plans that people have announced include Dublin or Frankfurt or both, in our case. And so the Irish government and the regulators are quite clearly seeing themselves as potential future financial services centres, and that's all about services. So what sort of future? The thing that the industry most worries about is fragmentation of all sorts, of capital, of regulatory capital or liquidity. And all the plans that you've seen so far are the easy bit of the plan. They're about banking licenses and they're about people. Those are the short-term, easier to do things. The things that make people, the really expensive stuff, is liquidity in the markets and regulatory capital. And if those are fragmented across the system, e.g. there is less interaction between the UK and the EU, and the supervisors don't cooperate as much, the cost of these plans rockets enormously. The regulatory capital you're required to hold by the regulator multiplies up significantly if you fragment the system. So the industry is counselling against fragmentation, against a breakup of the interconnectivity that already exists in the financial services sector. Put it another way, if you're clearing your trades, most of them are cleared in London, and maybe the vast majority of European trading is cleared through London. That's because global investors want the deepest possible liquidity. If you chop that up and force some of it to be inside the EU 27 and some of it to be in London, if you are a large Japanese conglomerate asking for your trades to be cleared, New York looks cheaper. It's not about London or Frankfurt or Paris. New York looks cheaper than any of these places because that's the deepest pool of liquidity possible. So what we're saying to the regulators and the governments, think about this as you go forward. remember financial services, remember services in whatever deal that you're trying to cut. And the Irish government, I think, has a particularly strong role and voice in this, given where it's pitching its future industry and what it's hoping to locate into Dublin in the coming years and months. So I suppose if I want to boil it down into a nutshell, do you want global capital for EU firms, e.g. the cheapest possible, or do you want EU capital for EU firms? A little bit smaller, a little bit safer, a little bit more closed. I mean, these are political options, these are not industry options. And you can have either, but it's a political choice. So EU capital, EU savings for EU firms, or accessing the wider world. And I think those are the choices that actually, if we get through the next 6 to 18 months, those are the sorts of questions people need to ask themselves. Thank you.
Fabulous real-world perspective there. It's cheaper in New York. The Irish government ought to be careful what it wishes for if it wants to see the fragmentation of capital markets. Luckily, we have a representative of the Irish government here to speak to us. Gerald.
Okay, good afternoon. It is just 1 minute past 12, so I'll try and keep to the 5 minutes. So thank you indeed to the UK and the Changing Europe for assembling such a high quantity and high quality gathering that just shows the level of interest in the Ireland of Ireland issues today, and thanks again to Anand and the team. But I mean, this session is about Ireland post-Brexit. It's about our preparations for life after the UK leaves the EU. We regret that the UK is leaving the EU, but for now, it is a reality. Now, we started to prepare contingency plans for this scenario in the early part of 2016, and they were ready in June 2016 when the result came through. We knew a little thing or two about referendums and how they can go against the establishment voice of the day. So we planned for that contingency. But of course, we weren't to know exactly how things would pan out and evolve. But nonetheless, there was a large document there on the 24th of June 2016, which we didn't particularly want to reach for. But it stated that, you know, the same things we're stating today, 2 years on, which is that we need to maintain an open border. We need to preserve the common travel area between Ireland and the UK. We need to, and we will, remain in the European Union and at the heart of it, in the Eurozone. And that we need to maintain the closest possible relationship with the UK and work for the closest possible relationship between the UK and the EU. Now, the previous session to this session dealt with the Good Friday Agreement, and this date of this conference is no accident. It's the 20th anniversary of the day that 71% of the population in Northern Ireland voted for the Good Friday Agreement and 94% in the South voted for the Good Friday Agreement. I think Colin in the previous session rightly said that there was a lot of genius in that agreement, a lot of compromise, all right, but a lot of genius. No one saw this day come 20 years later, but there are a lot of elements in that agreement which can help us design a new Irish-British or Irish-UK relationship for the period ahead. I know, Peter, I think you want to kind of tease out this a little bit further, but a key element of this is the kind of the East-West relations, the relations between Dublin and London, and indeed between Dublin and Cardiff and Edinburgh and Belfast. We have, in the Good Friday Agreement, institutions we can work with. The British-Irish Council. We have the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which Attain spoke about in the last session as well. We have the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which was originally set up in the late 80s to try and build links again. We need to keep the kind of links that built friendships and relationships and working relationships and understanding through the 80s and 90s into today. If we're no longer having ministers and officials meeting each other, I think it is 26 times in 26 meetings a day in Brussels, we have to look to replace that. And, you know, for example, John Major and his Irish counterpart Albert Reynolds, who signed the Downing Street Declaration, which led to ceasefires and on to the Good Friday Agreement, met in the ECOFIN Council in Brussels. We need to look at that, and our Deputy Prime Minister Simon Coveney has ventured ideas about a kind of a ministerial summit kind of process, new kind of layers of cooperation between the two countries, because the relationships will be important. I want to briefly touch on Ireland in the European Union, which Brigid dealt with in detail there. 86% supported staying in the EU immediately after the Brexit referendum. The figure has risen to 92%. yes, we will definitely miss the UK being in the room with us. We work together on so many things, like above all the single market and the completion of it, and the promotion of international trade, and many other issues. We weren't always on the same side, not on agriculture, for example, and indeed the UK hasn't been in the room for Eurozone meetings and Eurozone summit meetings, including through the recent financial crisis. So there are areas where the UK wasn't already there. We have to now get used to a new reality, and Brigid spoke of new alliances which we should be building and are working on. We're diversifying further as well. It's about 17% of our trade is with the UK, a little more than that, tiny bit more with that with the US, about twice that again is with the rest of the EU. So in clear trading terms, we're diversifying further and further away, when back in the 1970s it was about 2/3 of our trade was with the UK. And we're expanding our sort of diplomatic and trade office networks all around the world, into South America, into Asia, into the Eurozone in particular. So we need to diversify our trade to respond to this. Final comment, I think, and then happy to go into the discussion, just about the inevitable question of the border. This is a fundamental question to the Irish government. It is the top priority to maintain an open border. It's also the objective of the UK government and of the EU. So we're hearing now that there are potentially new or developed proposals coming from the UK government. We're looking forward to seeing them in black and white. We will look at any workable proposal, but we have to look at the ingredients of what makes a border open. Customs is one element, but regulatory alignment is another. And we also are still seeking a backstop, and if the UK propose an alternative proposal to what's on the table, we will of course look at it and see it when it's in black and white. So, fundamental point though, huge friendship with the UK, huge trading relationship. We have achieved so much together. Relations really came to an excellent level just a few years ago. This is a huge issue for everybody, and it's difficult to negotiate, but the friendship will live on. Thank you very much.
Gerald, thank you. Interesting, balanced presentation, I think, and I want to sort of maybe start briefly before we go to the floor, and there will be time for questions, to talk about balance, actually. Brigid, you said the future of Ireland is not in the Anglosphere. Alan, you cautioned about the costs of fragmentation, of becoming too European. Federico, you mentioned there would be costs. For example, Ireland might have to give some ground on the tax question, on the Apple question. I wonder whether we think, Gerald, to your point about whether or not it's possible at the end of this process, which is souring relations between London and Dublin, we know that. I mean, we know that David Liddington and the Taoiseach have their love-ins every couple of weeks, but the rest of the relations are pretty bad. Some old reflexes are being dug up as a result of this process. Is it possible, do we think, to emerge from this process with a balanced East-West relationship? Who wants to take that first, whether in a commercial perspective or a political perspective? Perhaps Gerald.
I think there's enough depth in the relationship, enough investment in recent decades to sort of come back to a sort of a balanced relationship. This is the toughest negotiation anyone has gone through. It's extremely tough on the UK government, extremely tough on the UK Parliament, very tough across the EU as well, and tough in our Parliament and government, and we have a confidence and supply government as well. It is so fundamental and so detailed with so many uncertainties, it's bound to bring tensions with it. But I mean, we had huge tensions historically over a long time, you know, up to the mid to late 80s, and we managed to sort of move beyond those. So I think the personal relations are still okay. You know, thankfully, to quote Barnier, the clock is ticking, and when the clock stops ticking, let's hope we're in a better place.
Just to follow up, because you mentioned the Irish border, and I don't want to get sucked down that rabbit hole necessarily, but what the Brits might be proposing, when all is said and done, is that we remain. The backstop is there in the withdrawal agreement. We remain in a customs union until such time as the Max Fac ferry sorts out the Irish border problem, and we remain highly aligned or even completely aligned with the single market for goods. Now, Barnier will argue that's cherry picking. What would be the Irish government's, because that would be an eminently practical solution to your concerns, would it not?
Sure. We just have to see these proposals in black and white. You know, I hear of a 100-page kind of white paper coming. That's proposals in black and white. We'll see what's laid before the task force, and we'll talk about it. Based on what's kind of rumoured at the moment, no matter what, we need this backstop as part of the agreement, because it's an unless and until, it's an insurance policy that we don't want to have to cash in, but we need it there to be able to cash in if called upon. So we'll see what the proposals are. We need to see them in black and white.
Dodging. Okay. Brigid, you said the future. I know you're very kind of forward on this, but actually Ireland's commercial future, does Ireland not need to hedge its bets a little bit?
So just so that I'm not misunderstood, what I meant when I said Ireland's future was not in the Anglosphere, I meant that Ireland's geopolitical anchor would be Europe, in the traditional way in which small states need geopolitical anchors. In other words, Ireland will not leave the EU to have the UK or the Anglosphere as its geopolitical anchor. But Ireland has always managed to play several worlds. So, I hear the debate in this country on global Britain. Ireland is the second most globalised country in the world. It does global. It's already, as we heard, it's working on expanding its diplomatic relations across the world. So Ireland will work with the UK, with the US, with the rest of the world, but the geopolitical anchor will be the EU. Okay. So that's how, I just don't want to be misunderstood.
Okay. Federico, we're going to come to the business guys in a second, but do you think there will come a moment where Ireland becomes a bridge back to the UK, or do you think, to your veiled warnings, that it's the way that the EU operates is it's going to make it quite an either-or choice for the Irish?
Well, let me say something I said elsewhere before, that I think Ireland it's in a conundrum, because it's at the same time the toughest and the softest member states vis-à-vis the UK. So it's the toughest in phase one of the negotiation, because they have a clear political priority, the border issue that has to be solved, and that's an exclusive Irish issue. I mean, no other member state has that kind of problem, although every other member state has been backing Ireland. But in the phase two of the negotiation, Ireland is the softest member state, because it's the EU country that would like to have the closest possible relation with Britain. I think Gerald mentioned that in his own presentation. So I think that's the conundrum for the Irish government. I have great respect for the way how they've been working, because it's...
But does that mean that there will come a point where the emperor has no clothes, where the Irish backstop, which they're pushing so hard, ultimately the most catastrophic outcome for Ireland would be no deal at all if the Brits hold their nerves and look the Irish in the eye and say, well, chaps, good luck.
Right, but that's the point that Gerald was making now, that the backstop is an insurance policy. I mean, you want it there just in case the worst happens, but you are hopeful that you will be able to find a framework for future relation. And I think, the economic interest, and that goes really to the business people of the panel, are pushing in that direction. So I think it would be foolish for the two parties not, to sort of end up with a cliff edge scenario, which would be extremely disruptive. And I think it's very reasonable, for all the issues we've discussed this morning, that Ireland is insisting on finding a short-term solution as an insurance policy for the border in case there will be no further steps.
Okay, so turning to the I don't want to bifurcate you all into business and business and politics, business and pleasure. If we end up in with the UK trying to do an FTA, and I take your point that there's been an awful lot of focus on goods, when actually one of the arguments made to the Brexiteers is don't get so hung up on goods, keep your powder dry for services. But if we get into a situation, which I think is where we're probably headed, where Max Fac wins the argument in Whitehall, and essentially we call it Max Fac, any fac, it's fac, right? It's how you facilitate a trading relationship when you're doing a mixed FTA with the EU. Where does that leave the business and the finance world in your view?
Well, I totally get the point that the constitutional questions are taking priority now, the big political questions. I suppose our point of view has always been there are economics, and during the referendum campaign, facts, numbers, and economics was downgraded. And we're saying in this round of negotiations, don't make that same mistake. Factor this in now. Don't leave services 86% of your economy outside a future relationship. Build it into the negotiations from the get-go. Don't make it an add-on. Don't do a free trade agreement, Canada style, that only focuses on goods with the hope of somehow adding in.
But the single market for services is not terribly developed, and you can make an argument there isn't a great deal of services
for
in
financial services.
counterfeit.
It's extremely well developed, and that's the point. It's the one bit of the services in the single market that actually does work. Bankers don't have a great reputation. The financial services sector doesn't have a great reputation, but London generates huge amounts of capital that whether you're sitting in Germany in the Mittelstand getting a loan from your savings bank, that savings bank is raising money in London. Now that value chain is not well understood, but actually the Mittelstand does benefit from having a global centre. And we're saying don't lose the value of a global centre in all your negotiations.
So if you were advising the Irish government, lobbying the Irish government, you're telling them don't overcook it.
Don't go for a short-term solution and keep your eye on the big prize, which is a long-term, and I hate phrases like win-win, but there is a win-win, which is cooperation and mitigating fragmentation.
Catherine.
Thanks, Peter. I think I'll stick with financial services to start with. I'll use another service industry just to illustrate the point. But if you think about mass FAC or any facilitation, and if you think about financial services in that context, it's actually less about the physical border and more about the tech, the tech trusted traders, the exemptions, the deals. But I think what becomes really important, financial markets, it's an irrefutable law that capital will flow into the most efficient market. And right now, London is a highly efficient world player. And the issue with that efficiency, I think, is over time any form of regulatory divergence. It is a very complex sector. You go into insurance, you have Solvency II, you go into banking, you have CRD4, you have MiFID, you have EMIR, we're regulated to death. And any kind of divergence that UK would choose from that will undermine it playing as an industry. So leaving aside the border issue and just sticking with the pure economics of it, there's a need to be mindful around the long-term game is a really important perspective.
Do you feel that the European side have got that right? I mean, there's a lot of talk about forcing banks to subsidiarise rather than branch into Europe, which is going to require them to, bring senior executives and capital into Europe potentially. To your point about fragmentation, do you feel that both Dublin and Europe have, aside from their own offensive interests in Brexit, do you feel they're getting the balance right, or as a banker are you worried?
I suppose as a banker, I always worry. I'm not sure whether that's my personality type or the fact that I'm a banker. It's probably a bit of both. I think, risk, we're in the business of risk, and, we have to take measured risks. And if you look at passporting, we're very active in the UK. It's a very strong market for us. We've already worked through, we do have a plan, a very clear plan around our actions, and we have worked through the three alternatives that may be needed. And to be fair to the UK regulators and authorities, they have been really clear and really responsive and helped all of the players here to work through that. So I think you will see at a professional level, at a regulatory level, everybody wants this to work. The challenge and the worry is that when you take it out of the initial negotiations and into the world of full practice, that divergence I speak of is a key concern over time. And it speaks to what Alan spoke to earlier, which is you undermine, potentially the ability of the UK to play in a global stage, and Europe being a key part of that as a key player.
So the city lose. Just before we go to the floor, which we will do now, and do you have a sense of apples and oranges, what the costs are in fragmentation? Is it a cost to European businesses raising capital? Because when I'm in Berlin or Paris, they're sort of saying, well, it's supply and demand, honey. If they put the squeeze on London, capital will move. As you say, we'll have our own European raising. Frankly, that's what we're kind of happy with that.
Well, there's a very good report from PwC. I think it came out in February. And it said the annual, not the cumulative, the annual costs by 2030 are 1.5% of UK GDP annually of the cost of fragmentation only in financial services, and about half of that inside the EU 27. And that's on an annual basis. That's a huge amount of inefficiency in the system. So, yes, it's not evenly distributed. So, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe pays disproportionately higher price for the cost of this fragmentation. I'm saying that is all investable capital that is not going to the firms, the small companies.
Right, questions. Please, we've got 10 minutes or so, so questions, not speeches, please. Usual drill, please say who you are, where you're from. Yes, in the back, yeah.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. My question to Dublin, and so if Macron impose corporation tax, universal corporation tax in European Union, nowadays, Ireland advantage is 12.5% corporation tax in European Union. So if Merkel and Macron combinations impose more maybe 20 or 25% corporation tax. Still, there is an advantage for Ireland to stay in European Union.
Okay, lovely. So if Macron gets his way on the EU-wide corporation tax, where will that leave the EU? We'll take a couple more, and then we'll. Dennis.
Thank you. Dennis Michel. Thank you so much. Dennis Michel. I worked for 15 years in Geneva. And when the single market came in, it was extraordinary to see all my Swiss friends scurrying to find any kind of European ancestor so they could have an EU passport just for ease of convenience to go and work. And Switzerland's the most friendly European country. They speak French, German, Italian, Russian, English, but they're not in the EU single market. That's why they're in London. We're out of the single market. There ain't going to be any win-win. We're out of the single market period. And I hope at some stage before we're out, some bank says that. But specifically on that, really, I think to Katherine, partly maybe to Gerald, that there are 1,200 major Irish firms operating in the UK worth 32 billion. There are 50,000 Irish citizen directors of UK firms. Why don't we have anything from them in this debate? The Irish diaspora voice, the Irish. We've got Michael Leary in Dublin, and we've got this Paul Dretcher at the CBI who blows hot and cold. We've got this massive lobbying weight, 2 weekly papers, huge influences in chambers of commerce, regional CBIs, politics, golf clubs, bars, racecourses, the lot.
Have no racial stereotyping in this one.
No, absolutely absent in this debate. I mean, Ireland really is pathetic. The government's brilliant, but Ireland as a nation in this country is doing nothing in this debate. Why?
Thank you, Dennis.
Why?
Pathetic Ireland. We'll come to that. And let's take one more, David Henniker, and then we'll bash through some answers. I'm only bobbing up and down because I keep told that no one at the back can see. We are here.
David Hennig from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Uncertainty was mentioned. Given that there is a lot of talk about the transition, not in fact finishing in December 2020, but a kind of ongoing period where nobody quite knows how we're going to fix the border, how are we going to deal with a period of uncertainty that may last 4 years? And that's for both business, politics, government, everybody.
Okay, lovely. So let's do quickly Macron. Who wants to do Macron and the corporation tax?
Everybody wants to do Macron.
So firstly, on Macron and corporation tax, change in the tax regime is based on unanimity under European treaties, so therefore Ireland would have to agree to the change. They won't. But what the Irish must do is not continue a process whereby large multinational companies pay significantly less than the 12.5%. They need good due diligence at domestic level in regulatory terms.
Just to follow up on this, I think the tax issue is becoming increasingly complicated. It's true you have unanimity, but you can use enhanced cooperation to move forward. Plus, I think we increasingly see the use of intergovernmental agreements that's outside the EU treaty framework, and I think that's the scenario which is most likely going to take place in Europe if Macron's plans move forward. But having said that, I think the corporate tax issue has to be cleared out a bit. Brigid rightly said before, The Apple case is different. It's actually not about taxation. It's about state aid. It's about the fact that the state doesn't apply the same tax rates to all the competitors, and I think the Commission is dead right in pursuing that case, even though the case is pending judicial adjudication in the ECJ. But the issue of corporate taxation is something where I think Ireland can move forward and shape the discussion. In reality, there is a lot of rhetoric about what the Commission has been proposing with the CCBT, but we are not talking about a sort of a uniform corporate tax rate across Europe. We are really talking about calculating corporate taxation in the same way, and the Commission proposal is to add basically a federal corporate tax on top of the state tax. Now, that federal corporate tax will be the same across all EU member states, but the state tax will still be in Ireland the lowest across the EU member states. So I think from an Irish perspective, that would not represent really a competitive disadvantage. Can I just take the chance of having the mic to say something on transition? Or not?
Let's just stick with one subject, just because I know Alan wants to come in on Macron.
Just a very small point on the tax. So the US tax changes are now going to throw into massive relief for US corporations around the world as they invest. For the first time in a very long time, differential tax rates will be quite important, because previously you always paid up into the US, the differential. Now if you're below the US or above the US, it actually starts to matter.
That's a really good point. Do you want to go on to this question about why the Irish lobby, if such a thing exists? That was directed at you, Katherine. Perhaps you two ought to tackle that one.
Yeah, having followed the debate obviously extremely closely right from before the referendum, generally, the business voice here was generally quite muted. That was our sense across the board, not just from the Irish business voice as well. But I could cite some examples of some other figures there. One, Michael O'Leary of Ryanair was pretty prominent. I know he's a divisive figure, but nonetheless, he painted his aircraft in Irish referenda campaign, but nonetheless is a huge player in obviously the aviation sector. Niall Fitzgerald, the former head of Unilever, is extremely active. The British Irish Chamber of Commerce are extremely active. Our Deputy Prime Minister's brother is head of the company which is the biggest Irish employer in the UK, Greencore, also quite outspoken, including on the area of access to quality staff, which come from within the EU and outside it. So there's been quite a lot of voice, but I think really the problem is the business voice hasn't been that strong across the board here in the UK.
I think that's a very fair point. Katherine?
What I would say to that is they may not be loud, but they're very effective. And what I mean by that is within sectors they're very active. Also remember that a lot of the foreign direct investment international companies have their EMEA headquarters in Ireland. A lot of them are headed by Irish who are speaking with an EMEA hat on, not necessarily just Irish. The other thing I would say with respect to this is that they're very active in your Confederation of British Industry. So I certainly see them. They have very strong dialogue with us, but they do it within their sector. I'm not sure what benefit they would get. They're very active on the capital gain tax front too, but I'm not sure what benefit they would get to trying to create some kind of diaspora within the UK outside of their sector, because I'm not sure what right they would have to do that, to be frank, and I'm not sure what the effectiveness of it would be.
You could argue if British business can't lobby, how could Irish?
Yeah, well, they are. I can tell you they are very active. They are extremely active, and they're active. I see a lot of them through the Dublin Chamber as well in terms of anything we do with government, be it on tax, be it on infrastructure. So I think what I would say is they're practical rather than political. I think it's fair to say. And you're all talking about the air transport and Michael O'Leary. Dublin-London is the busiest international route, in the world. And that whole issue of the open skies is really critical, and I can tell you there are an awful lot of very active Irish in the UK on that particular aspect. So they are active in their sector, if that's helpful.
That's good. Federico, we'll go back to you very quickly on the whole question of uncertainty, which is a broad topic. I know you wanted to talk on that.
Yeah, sorry, just I wanted to say a couple of words on transition, because I think the question of transition is often misunderstood, but technically speaking, we are already in the transition now. That's what Article 50 creates, 2 years for a state to get out of the EU. So we are already pushing that limit to extreme by adding 2 extra years, and I think there's legal limits to how long we could extend a transition in the future. Having said that, I think the interesting added value of transition is that it basically gives Britain the opportunity of experiencing life, of being part of essentially the EEA. because the conditions of transition are exactly the same that Norway has in its participation to the internal market. So that might actually provide some time for Britain to also rethink its long-term interest.
That old chestnut. Brigid, briefly if you may, because I want to...
Very quickly on uncertainty. I think the reality is that Brexit will create legal, political, institutional and economic uncertainty for this country for a long time to come. It will remain extremely unsettled because it is a dynamic process. It is a living field experiment in the 21st century of untying the ties of interdependence. No other country has ever tried to do this. It is an experiment.
Fabulous. Go on. So, yes.
Just on the uncertainty point. I mean, for business, uncertainty means you over-prepare, you plan for the worst, which is not actually the most efficient way of planning. So you actually spend more than you should and you do more than you should. But even worse than that, there's a path dependency, a new framework gets set, which may be unintended. So that the path dependency where you start determines where you end up. You end up in a different place if you had more certainty than you had less certainty. And it may not be the right place.
Right, we are moments away from, I think, sandwiches. Well, we can have sandwiches or we can have one more round of questions. I don't mind. One more round? The boss says one more round. Well, the real boss is not here. There he is. Okay, let's do 3 more questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to play devil's advocate on the Apple.
Just 1 second, I want to get the mic.
Just to play devil's advocate on the Apple question, surely there is methods in madness in the arrangement, because what the Irish Treasury losing tax revenue, they probably save a lot in things like unemployment benefit, as Apple is obviously in a position to employ more people and generate more economic activity. Food for thought.
Okay. Yes.
Peter Wilson-Smith from Mauritius. Can you say something about the sort of transport issues for Irish trade post-Brexit? Because that's a huge issue. And I mean, how easy is it going to be if the border issue can't be solved satisfactorily to reroute trade and by shipping, for instance, to continental Europe?
Thank you. That's a good practical question. All done? Yes, lovely. Okay. Why don't we start with the transport question, because there's an interesting one, and people often want to know what practically is going to be the case. We hear reports of companies opening new shipping routes, etc. What's it going to look like when it's all said and done? Katherine?
It is a key concern, and the big thing is time delays. Behind the time delays is the whole complexity of the competitiveness if you have tariffs, because a border obviously means you're policing something. The UK has itself traditionally been a land bridge into Europe, even for hauliers. Not just one specific part of transport. So that is probably going to be the most dislocated subsector, and one of the key concerns is that whole, because if you think about it, every product that has to move is impacted by the transport sector. And so in addition to tariffs, in addition to complexities and cost, there's time delays. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that earlier in terms of acceptable shelf life. So that is a big concern.
Do we think that is where max FAC is going to come in? I mean, part of the north-south border question, when I talk to people in Brussels, I often hear that actually what they really mean about max FAC is where there need to be additional east-west checks. That is where actually, max FAC really can reduce the time it takes to transit through Laffan or Holyhead or wherever it might be.
I think if you look at it purely from that perspective, then yes, it is a response. I think the reason everybody, certainly on our part of the island, breaks out in a severe allergy when you say that is because the whole issue of criminality, the whole issue of Ireland's reputation in terms of becoming a source of smuggling is just something we don't want to...
But is it the Norway-Sweden border, they don't have ultra frictionless arrangements, but partly because they need to change the law in both countries, and partly because it's expensive and they have an existing system, a legacy system. In your understanding, would it be actually possible when you're building a new system from scratch actually to make it really pretty frictionless.
If you didn't have a sea in between Ireland and the UK, perhaps, which they don't have on the mainland of Europe. I mean, there have been talks about, and you've all heard them, about the length of queues, even if you do have a max fact type of facility. I do think over time, Peter, there are things you can work through. You know, business capital will always find a way. I think our challenge is we see all of that as suboptimal to a fully free border, and everything else is seen in that light. Of course, over time we'll work it out. The critical thing that none of us have actually mentioned today, and this is really important, is that whether it's transport or any other sector, that we don't have cliff edges, because cliff edge decisions cause huge casualties economically. And whatever we do, we need to allow for a transition into it. But everything in terms of the transport sector is suboptimal to the current status.
I'm going to give the last word to Gerald.
Okay. Look, no, it's a very fundamental issue, and actually, you know, there is a paragraph in the joint report in December. Everybody focused on paragraph numbers 49, 50, and others, but there is a paragraph to look at the question of the land bridge. But 70% of goods leaving Ireland for the European Union outside of the UK go through Great Britain. So you're talking about moving into concentrated spaces in Wales and north and south, and on mostly to Dover, where there will be a lot of pressure already. So this is urgent, and something kind of serious needs to be done on it. Can kind of direct sea routes entirely replace that? The fact is, honestly, no. There's some people who are going to expand the port of Cork, the port of Rosslare. There are some new shipping routes moving out of Dublin and Rosslare and Cork as well. People investing in ships. That's very good. It'll never entirely replace the land bridge, so this is among the issues we seriously need to resolve. Really, really quick point, if I may, on taxation. Yes, Brigid is entirely right. You know, sort of unanimity still applies. We faced down an attempt to increase our corporation tax rates in the middle of the financial crisis when we were under pressure, trying to reduce the loan rates on the bailout. We're pretty resolute on this. But there have been adjustments in successive budgets. It's a global issue, as was mentioned there, working in the OECD as well. So it's broader than simply in the Eurozone, the tax debate.
Lovely. Well, a massive subject, and one that's made so difficult by the fact that none of us know what's going to happen and what it's going to look like. But a brilliant panel. Thank you to the UK and the EU. Amazing variety of people. Federico, Brigid, Katherine, Gerald, Alan and Gerald.